They wanted perfection. No stains, no flaws, no me. My father's new wife said you'd ruin the image, and he agreed. I didn't fight for a seat at their table. I waited. Weeks later, her luxury car show exploded in failure, and every phone in Denver lit up with one name. Mine. I'm Madison Hale, and this is how karma sounds when the engine finally starts. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The smell of motor oil hung in the air that morning, sharp and familiar. The kind of smell that stayed on your hands no matter how much soap you used. I had the hood of a '68 Mustang open, sunlight spilling across the metal like a cold mirror. Country music hummed from the old radio on the shelf, the singer's voice slow and cracked, the sound of someone who'd lost something and learned to live with it. My phone buzzed on the workbench. Dad's name flashed on the screen. I wiped my hands on a rag that was already black with grease and picked it up. Madison. He said, his tone careful, like he was reading from a script. I wanted to tell you before you heard it somewhere else. I'm getting remarried. The ceremony's next month. For a second, I didn't say anything. The hum of the shop filled the silence, that low mechanical drone that always made more sense to me than people did. That's good, Anna managed. There's something else, he said quickly, the way people rush through words that hurt to say. Vivian doesn't think it would be appropriate for you to attend. She worries you'd feel out of place. You know how these events are. Formal press investors. I could almost hear him rubbing the back of his neck, trying to sound reasonable while stepping over the line between shame and pride. Out of place, I repeated. Because I fix engines. She just wants things to look right, he said. You know how image matters in her world. I stared at the Mustang's chrome, bumper-warped light, bending my reflection until I barely recognized myself. Sure, I said. I understand. Don't take it personally, he added. I won't. I lied, then hung up before he could fill the silence with excuses. The radio clicked to a new song, something brighter that felt wrong for the moment. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing down. Heavier than the smell of oil and steel. I set the phone on the workbench, watched the screen go dark, and listened to the emptiness that followed. On the wall above the tool rack was an old photo of Mom. Caroline Hale, smiling with her hair tied up, grease on her cheek, holding the same Mustang, when it was still more rust than car. Her handwriting was scrawled in the corner of the frame. Don't forget why you love what you do. I reached up, touched the edge of the frame with my fingertips. They've already replaced me in the picture, Mom, I said softly. Something inside me twisted, not anger exactly. More like a familiar ache I'd stopped noticing until someone pressed on it. The wrench I'd been using slipped from my grip and hit the concrete floor with a sharp metallic clang. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, the kind that looks peaceful until you have to drive through it. I walked to the open garage door, arms crossed against the cold, and watched flakes melt on the warm hood of the car. The world felt quiet, stripped clean. My reflection stared back from the windshield, face smudged, hair tied back, eyes tired but steady. I'd never looked less like the kind of daughter someone would display at a wedding. And somehow that thought didn't sting as much as it should have. They call it an image, I whispered. I call it a shadow. The radio faded under the sound of the wind pushing through the doorway. I turned back to the workbench to close up for the night and noticed a white envelope lying among the tools. It must have come in with the parts shipment that morning. My name was written in looping gold letters, Miss Madison Hale, inside a piece of cardstock thick enough to stand on its own. The wedding of Richard Hale and Vivian Brooks, formal attire. Only, I stood there for a long moment, the smell of oil and snow mixing in the air, the paper bright against my stained fingers. A drop of grease smeared across the word formal. I almost laughed. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and endless. I set the invitation down on the bench beside the wrench and went back to the car. The engine waited, half-open, patient. I wiped my hands, took a breath, and picked up where I left off. Some things I decided were worth showing up for. This wasn't one of them. Morning light spilled across downtown Denver, bouncing off glass towers like pieces of a mirror. From the 42nd floor of the Golden Arc building, the city looked spotless. Every street scrubbed clean by distance. Inside the conference room, Vivian Brooks Hale stood at the head of a long table, a white suit pressed to perfection, a diamond pin catching the light each time she moved. Again, she said, pointing at the large screen where the slides for the Golden Arc Classic Auto Expo flickered. The color scheme is off. It's supposed to be champagne, not gold. Her PR manager, a young woman with a nervous smile, hurried to adjust the hue on her laptop. Vivian crossed her arms. No scratches, no flaws, no scandal. That's our motto. Write it down. I had never been in a room like that, bright cold, smelling of money instead of motor oil. But I could imagine it perfectly, the sound of heels clicking, the hum of air conditioning, the kind of quiet that costs more than it's worth. Vivian paced behind the table, checking every frame of the promotional video, as if searching for dust. When I say restoration, she told her team, I mean rebirth. These cars aren't just machines. They're symbols. We're giving history a facelift. At the far end of the room sat Eleanor Grant, director of the National Heritage Auto Museum. At 58, she carried herself with the kind of calm that made other people straighten up when she entered. She had seen real restorations, the kind done with grit and burnt fingers, not PR lighting. Vivian clicked to the next slide. The image filled the wall, a gleaming model of a vintage V8 engine. A soft gasp went around the room. This, Vivian said, is the heart of our exhibit. The new restoration prototype, custom-built, cutting-edge, exclusive to Golden Arc. Applause followed, but Eleanor didn't join in. She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, and stared at the design. The lines of the manifold, the placement of the distributor. It wasn't just familiar. It was identical. Years ago, she'd reviewed an application from a small shop in Boulder called Hale Restoration. A woman named Madison had submitted this exact blueprint as part of her grant proposal. Eleanor remembered being impressed by its precision, by the way art and engineering met halfway in those curves. Now, here it was, projected 20 feet high in a skyscraper boardroom claimed by someone else. A young technician near the display table noticed a faint chip in the paint on the miniature model. He panicked, pulled a polishing cloth from his pocket, and tried to buff it out before Vivian saw. Too late. "What's this?" she snapped, snatching the model from his hands. "Imperfections don't belong here. If I see something like that on the exhibition floor, you'll be polishing your resume instead." The kid mumbled an apology. Eleanor closed her notebook slowly, her mind already working. She'd seen this type before, people who mistook shine for substance. Vivian placed the model back on the stand and forced a smile as two photographers entered. "Let's make sure to capture the spirit of excellence," she said, stepping into the center of the frame. Golden Arc brings history back, flawless, timeless, and marketable. Flashes popped, cameras clicked. Every photo showed Vivian framed perfectly against the Denver skyline, all teeth and confidence. Eleanor turned to her assistant, whispering, "Did we ever confirm the source of that engine design?" The assistant blinked. Vivian said it came from her in-house team. Eleanor nodded, but didn't reply. She leaned back, studying the projection again. At the lower right corner, nearly invisible in the shine, were two faint letters engraved in the schematic HUM, Hale Restoration. She exhaled slowly. No one else in the room seemed to notice. The presentation continued. Buzzwords floating through the air: innovation, prestige, legacy. Vivian thrived in it, moving like a conductor before an orchestra that dared not miss a note. But to Eleanor, the music had a sour chord underneath. She jotted a quick note on her pad, just 3 words. "Check source file." Then she closed it and rose from her seat as the room erupted in applause again. Vivian turned toward her. "Eleanor, I hope the museum will be proud to partner with us on this. We're redefining restoration for the modern age." Eleanor smiled politely. "Restoration," she said, "depends on whose hands do the work." Vivian laughed, assuming it was a compliment. "And I have the best hands in the business." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the tiny etched letters one last time before she slipped her pen into her jacket pocket. "We'll see," she murmured. The meeting adjourned. Vivian shook hands with the investors, her diamond pin glittering like a small sun. As the room cleared, a janitor entered quietly to tidy up. He bent down to collect a crumpled printout that had fallen near the projector. When he straightened, the paper caught the light, an image of the same engine stamped faintly at the corner with the words, Hale Restoration Systems. He placed it on the table, assuming it belonged there. Outside, Denver glowed under a perfect blue sky, every window reflecting the city's clean, curated surface. Inside, behind the glass, the first crack had already formed. The wind on the hill smelled like rain and cold earth. The sky hung low, thick, and gray, the kind of gray that flattened everything it touched. I stood in front of the headstone that read Caroline Hale, 1965-2013, and laid a handful of wildflowers down, the stems bent under the weight of a few snowflakes that hadn't yet melted. "Hey, Mom," I said quietly. "If you were still here, you'd laugh. You'd laugh hearing that I wasn't pretty enough to sit at Dad's wedding." The words came out softer than I meant them to, almost like they belonged to someone else. I brushed the frost off the top of the stone and sat down on the damp ground, arms wrapped around my knees. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made me turn. Henry Cole's old pickup climbed the hill, coughing like it always did. He got out holding 2 paper cups of coffee from the gas station down the road. "I figured you'd be here," he said, handing me one. "You skipped breakfast again." "Does coffee count?" I asked. "It's a start." He settled beside me with a small grunt, looking out at the rows of stones that dotted the slope. "You know, when I was about your age, my boss used to say I'd never make it past the mailroom. Said I didn't look the part of a manager. Guess what happened when the company's servers went down for a week?" Smiled, half listening. "You fixed it." "I fixed it," he said. "Then I quit." Sometimes the best revenge is just doing the job right. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees that lined the edge of the cemetery. "She would have been proud of you, kid," he said after a moment. "You stuck to what you love. That's something. I don't know." I said, watching my breath turn white. "Some days it feels like all I've done is make it harder for him to look at me." Henry tilted his head. "That's his problem. Don't you carry that for him." We sat there a while, neither of us talking. The coffee cooled in my hands. A crow landed on a nearby fence post, black against the snow, and for a second, everything went still. When I finally stood, I pressed my palm flat against the headstone. "Bye, Mom," I whispered. By the time I got back to the garage, the clouds had thinned enough for the sun to cut through. Dust floated in the beams of light like slow-moving sparks. The Mustang waited in silence, its body half-painted, the air still carrying the smell of primer and steel. I turned on the small heater by my desk and opened my laptop to check the new messages. Most were invoices and supply orders, but one email at the top caught my eye. National Heritage Committee. Project selection notice. For a second, I thought it was spam. Then I clicked. "Dear Ms. Hale." It began. "We're pleased to inform you that your restoration project has been selected for presentation at the 2024 National Heritage Auto Exhibition." The words blurred before I even finished reading. I scrolled down to the bottom of the message where the logo appeared. A gold circle enclosing the name of the event, Golden Arc Classic Auto Expo. I froze. Golden Arc. The same company. The same name printed across every magazine cover about Vivian Brooks Hale's grand exhibition. My hand tightened around the mouse. The chair creaked as I leaned back, staring at the screen. It didn't make sense. How could the project I'd submitted months ago, the engine system Eleanor's committee had approved, be part of the same event Vivian was running? Unless... A rush of heat moved through me, sharp and familiar. I remembered Dad's voice, calm and distant on the phone. Vivian just wants things to look right. Maybe they already had what they wanted. Maybe they'd taken it. I stood, pacing a few steps across the floor. The old radio on the shelf clicked alive, as if by habit, catching a local news segment. The Golden Arc Expo promises to be the most prestigious automotive event of the decade, showcasing innovation artistry and precision craftsmanship. I reached over and turned the volume down until the voice became a whisper. The heater hummed. The silence felt heavier than before. I printed the email and watched the paper slide out warm and clean. The ink shimmered under the light as it dried. I took a piece of tape and pinned it to the wall above my workbench right next to Mom's photograph. For a long time I just stood there, looking from one to the other. The official letter with my name on it, and the smiling woman in the photo, who used to tell me, "Don't ever let them decide what's worth your hands." The sun broke through the clouds, catching the corner of the frame and scattering light across the wall. Maybe fate did have a sense of humor. Maybe it liked circles. I wiped my hands on a rag, left another coffee cup on the desk for Henry, and went back to the car. The world outside the garage door was still gray, but something in me had shifted. There was a spark now, small but real, sitting quietly beneath the noise. The ballroom glittered like it had been dipped in money. Chandeliers hung low over white linen tables, the air thick with perfume, and the soft hum of people pretending to care about one another. From a distance, I imagined the clinking glasses and polite laughter like the steady tick of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Vivian stood at the center of it all, the new Mrs. Brooks Hale, in a dress the color of champagne, smiling, with the kind of precision only money could buy. My father stood beside her, posture straight, his arm around her waist like a public apology for his past life. I wasn't there, of course, but I knew exactly how it would look. The Denver Post would call it a union of legacy and modern elegance. Somewhere in that same room, David Reed, a name I only knew later, lifted a glass of red wine and leaned toward Eleanor Grant, who'd been invited as one of the museum's partners. "I just funded a new restoration project out of Boulder," he said. "Young woman's small operation. Hale restoration. Brilliant work. Her design's up for the national award." Vivian caught a piece of that conversation and let out a soft laugh. "Oh, please," she said, tilting her head so the diamonds at her ears flashed. "Probably just another grease-stained mechanic with a fancy email signature." Eleanor looked at her for a long second before answering. Sometimes she said quietly, "Heritage is preserved by hands that aren't afraid to get dirty." Vivian blinked, unsure if she'd just been insulted, and turned away to greet another investor. Eleanor's eyes followed the reflection of the chandelier across the polished floor, her mind already piecing things together. The identical blueprints, the initials H, the name Hale that kept circling back. Outside of their perfect circle, I was in my garage in Boulder, wiping the same hands Vivian would never shake. The radio buzzed through static before settling on a live report. The Golden Arc Auto Expo, set to debut this winter, is already drawing attention for its luxury partnerships and innovative restoration technology. I switched the dial, but the voice followed me. Every station seemed to be talking about it. My reflection appeared in the window of the Mustang's door. Hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, grease smudged down my arm. The opposite of the people sipping champagne 30 miles away. They raise glasses to the image of perfection, while I clean my hands of what's real. I walked to my desk, flipping through a stack of invoices, trying not to think about what the name Hale sounded like in Vivian's mouth, how easily she might spit it out if someone mentioned it. The heater rattled in the corner. A single moth circled the fluorescent light above my head, bumping against it until its wings started to fray. Somewhere across the city, I imagined the click of a pen. Vivian sat in a private lounge after the dinner, her smile gone now that the photographers had left. Her assistant slid a stack of documents in front of her. "We'll need your signature tonight, Mrs. Brooks Hale. It's the licensing agreement for the restoration tech." She glanced over the top page. "Is this the system from our new supplier?" "Yes, ma'am. The design you approved last week." She didn't read the rest. Just signed with a practiced swirl of ink, the kind that didn't leave room for hesitation. If she'd looked closer, she might have noticed the watermark on the corner of the blueprint paper, Hale Restoration System. I didn't know any of this yet, but sometimes life has a way of letting you feel the weight of something before you even see it coming. That night, as I locked up the shop, I paused at the door. The air outside was sharp, the kind that smells like snow before it falls. I wiped my palms on my jeans, leaving faint streaks of grease that the light from the garage made shimmer. In Denver, Vivian raised another glass, her laughter echoing through the marble hall. In Boulder, I turned off the lights, the sound of my boots against the concrete, the only thing that kept the silence from swallowing me whole. Between us, there was a line neither of us could see yet, drawn in oil and ink waiting to be crossed. Snow was falling in Denver that afternoon, thin flakes twisting through the air like bits of torn paper. The city moved slower under it, muffled. From across the street I could see the stained glass windows of St. Mark's glowing faintly through the gray, warm light spilling into the cold like a secret I wasn't supposed to hear. Through the open church doors came the sound of a violin. Vivian stood at the top of the aisle, her dress a storm of white silk, a camera flash catching every turn of her smile. The photographers swarmed like bees. Reporters murmured to one another about Denver's power couple of the year. Richard stood beside her, hands clasped, the line of his jaw stiff. A reporter's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Hale, we heard you have a grown daughter. Will she be joining the celebration today?" Richard hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. "She's busy," he said finally. "She's working on a project out of town." Vivian's hand tightened around his. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes flashed sideways, a warning tucked beneath mascara and charm. The cameras kept clicking. I watched from across the square, half hidden behind the glass of a bakery window. The warmth from inside fogged the lower pane, so I had to lean to see. My reflection floated over theirs. Me in a flannel jacket, grease under my nails, them wrapped in light. I wasn't bitter anymore, just strangely still. No one invited me, but I wished them well in silence. A gust of wind pushed snow into my hair. I let it melt down my collar and turned away before the bells began to ring. Inside, Eleanor Grant approached the couple as guests began to file out for photos. She offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Vivian, the restoration technology you mentioned in the presentation last week. It's remarkable work. May I ask who developed it?" Vivian laughed softly, adjusting her bouquet. "My team did. We've been perfecting it for months." Eleanor nodded, lips pressed together. "Impressive. I look forward to seeing it in action." As she walked away, Vivian whispered something to Richard, who responded with a quiet sigh that barely moved his shoulders. The church bells rang again, this time louder, drowning out everything else. By the time they stepped outside for the group photos, I was already walking back toward my truck. The snow on the sidewalk was turning to slush, the kind that soaked through your boots in minutes. I kept my hands shoved deep in my jacket pockets, the invitation still folded inside, creased and forgotten, but somehow impossible to throw away. The drive back to Boulder was long and quiet. The mountains looked washed out in the distance, their peaks hidden behind a curtain of low clouds. The radio played a song I didn't recognize, something soft and slow. I turned it down until it was only a hum. When I reached the garage, the air inside was cold enough to see my breath. I flicked on the lights. They buzzed and stuttered before filling the space with a dull yellow glow. The Mustang's metallic body caught the reflection and threw it back at me, shimmering like liquid. I picked up a rag and wiped a streak of dust from the hood. The paint shone faintly like it remembered sunlight from another season. They chose the kind of light that blinds. I chose the kind that lets you see. I turned off the radio completely. In the silence, I could almost hear the faint echo of church bells carried by the wind through the open door. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was a pale silver sheet, and for a moment everything stood still. No engines, no voices, no laughter from a wedding I wasn't meant to attend. Only the hum of the heater, the smell of oil, and the quiet pulse of a heart that refused to envy anyone anymore. I stayed like that for a long time, my reflection caught in the curve of the car's fender. Part shadow, part steel, suspended between what I'd lost and what I still had. Then I turned off the lights, and the garage went dark, except for the faint outline of the Mustang glowing under the last bit of afternoon sun. The Denver Convention Center gleamed under a row of spotlights that could have lit a Broadway stage. 3 weeks after the wedding, the city had turned out in force for the grand opening of the Golden Arc Classic Auto Expo. Reporters crowded the entrance, their voices overlapping as cameras flashed against polished chrome. Inside, every car looked flawless beneath the light, until it didn't. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard the story before sundown. Vivian Brooks Hale stood on stage in a silver gown, smiling as she welcomed the crowd. "Tonight, we celebrate not just beauty," she said, "but perfection, brought back to life." The applause was instant. She gestured to the centerpiece of the event, a restored 1939 Cadillac, all curves, and shine, its black paint reflecting the chandeliers like a mirror. Somewhere behind the curtains, a technician turned the ignition to demonstrate the restoration process. What came out instead of the deep hum of a luxury engine was a hard metallic cough followed by a thin curl of smoke. Then more smoke. The front grille trembled. A small pop echoed across the hall, sharp enough to make the crowd flinch. Gasps spread through the room as the car sputtered again, paint cracking under the heat. The sweet chemical smell of burnt enamel filled the air. Phones shot up, filming every second. The host tried to joke. "Well, looks like she's got a little fire in her," but no one laughed. Vivian's smile froze. She turned toward the technicians, whispering, "Shut it off. Now." The microphone caught her voice, sending it through the speakers for everyone to hear. The lights flickered. Another car down the line refused to start, the hood vibrating before going silent. The sound of chaos moved like a wave, guests backing away, security rushing in, reporters calling out questions. By the time the fire alarms chirped once and stopped, the headlines had already written themselves. Across downtown TVs, in restaurants and office lobbies, replayed the footage, smoke rising in elegant white plumes over women in gowns and men in tuxedos. The scrolling caption read, "Luxury Auto Show Collapses." Backstage, Richard Hale slammed a folder onto a table so hard the papers scattered. "You've humiliated this company," he shouted. "Our name is attached to this disaster. Do you have any idea what this will cost us?" Vivian stood rigid, her makeup streaked from sweat, holding her phone like it might save her. "It wasn't the company's fault," she said. "It's the supplier. The parts. They must have been faulty." Eleanor Grant entered quietly from the side door, calm in the middle of the storm. She looked around the wreckage, reporters shouting outside, the sound of engines dying one by one. "Faulty parts don't explain bad restoration," she said. Vivian turned on her. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eleanor took a step closer. "It means you built your empire on something you didn't understand. You copied a design, but you never learned how it worked." Vivian blinked, then caught herself. "You have no proof of that." "I don't need proof," Eleanor said softly. "I've seen those blueprints before, and I know the woman who drew them." Richard looked from one to the other, his voice breaking the silence. Who Eleanor met his eyes, Madison Hale. The room fell still. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed to quiet. Vivian's face went pale, her hand tightening on the phone. "Absolutely not," she said. "We are not calling her." Eleanor's tone didn't change. "You don't have to, but you will. Because no one else in the city can fix what you've broken." Vivian shook her head. "I'd rather let the show burn." Richard stepped forward, his anger gone now, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to shame. "Vivian," he said, "make the call." Vivian's fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone. The screen reflected in her eyes as she scrolled through her contacts, stopping on my name. She stared at it for a long moment, then pressed call, back in bolder. I was at my workbench sorting through spare parts, while the evening news played softly on the small TV mounted near the tools. The reporter's voice carried through static. A shocking turn at tonight's Golden Arc Expo, as multiple vehicles failed during the live demonstration. Organizers have yet to comment. My phone buzzed against the table. The name on the screen glowed in bold white letters. Vivian Brooks Hale. For a moment, I just looked at it. The sound of the phone filled the garage, a steady, insistent vibration cutting through the quiet. Outside, wind pushed snow against the door, whispering down the seams. I could have answered. I could have said a dozen things, but instead I reached out and hit decline. The ringing stopped. Silence rushed in to fill the space it left. I set the phone back down, screen still lit. My reflection caught in it, steady calm, a face untouched by their panic. Let them choke on the smoke they made. The phone buzzed again, once then went still. The faint light from its screen spilled across the metal table, glowing softly over scattered bolts and a single wrench. I watched it fade, then turned back to my work, the sound of the dying engine from the TV, still echoing faintly behind me. Rain hammered against the tin roof like a restless drummer, steady and impatient. The smell of wet asphalt mixed with the sweet tang of motor oil, filling the garage with something almost comforting. I'd been up since dawn, sleeves rolled, tightening the bolts on the Chevy's rebuilt engine. It was the kind of work that slowed the world down, until my phone started to vibrate. The screen lit up beside the socket wrench. Vivian Brooks Hale, 16 missed calls. The number at the corner looked almost ridiculous, like a joke told too many times. I wiped my hands on a rag, the cloth coming away darker each time, and stared at it without moving. The rain grew louder. The lights flickered once before steadying again. Those calls hit my phone like a storm, and I knew that storm was just looking for somewhere to land. I didn't answer. Instead, I reached for the next part of the engine, fitting it into place. The sound of metal on metal drowned out the vibration. A moment later, the door creaked open, and Henry Cole stepped in, shaking the rain from his jacket. He held 2 paper cups of coffee, one already leaking through the thin cardboard. "Morning," he said, handing me one. "Thought you could use this." "Thanks," I said, taking it, the heat seeping through my fingers. He followed my gaze to the phone still buzzing on the workbench. "You gonna pick that up?" I shook my head. "No, I'm waiting for the rain to stop." Henry chuckled under his breath. "You mean the one outside? Or the one calling both?" The phone stopped for a few seconds, leaving a silence so sharp it felt like it might cut. Then it started again, relentless. I reached over, flipped it to silent, and slid it under an oily rag. Out of sight didn't mean out of mind, but it was the closest thing to peace I was going to get. Henry leaned against the doorframe, watching me work. You know I've lived long enough to see pride make people do stupid things. But calling 16 times. That's not pride anymore. That's panic. I didn't reply. The wrench slipped once, scraping my knuckle. A bead of blood welled up before I wiped it on my jeans. The rain eased to a softer rhythm, steady, almost like breathing. Henry sipped his coffee. She'll come around, you know. People always circle back to the ones they wronged when their pretty castles start to crack. I'm not interested in being anyone's last resort, I said. I did that once already. Didn't end well. He gave a slow nod, then pushed off the wall. Well, if you change your mind, at least let her work for your help. When he left, the garage felt even quieter. I sat on the stool by my desk, the coffee cooling in my hand. The clock ticked. I glanced at the far wall where two things hung side by side, Mom's photograph and the framed letter from the National Heritage Committee. The same one that confirmed my project had been chosen for their showcase. I studied them for a long time. The woman who taught me how to hold a wrench next to the proof that her lessons had meant something. Another vibration. The phone again. I ignored it, but the words of a new message slid across the dark screen. We need you. The exhibition collapsed. Please help me. There it was. Not an apology, not yet, but close. The kind of message that trembled between desperation and surrender. There are apologies that don't come with tears. Only panic. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, deep and tired. I let the message fade from the screen, the light dimming until only the reflection of the workbench remained. At that same moment, across the city, Vivian Brooks Hale was sitting in her glass-walled office at Golden Arc mascara smudged beneath her eyes, a half-empty glass of champagne sweating on the table beside her. Reporters crowded outside the building demanding statements. Her assistant whispered that the investors were pulling out, that Eleanor Grant hadn't returned a single call. Vivian ran her hands through her hair, gripping hard enough to leave marks on her scalp. She won't answer, she said. She's enjoying this. Eleanor's voice came through her memory, quiet and unshakable. You'll have to call her, Vivian whispered to no one I already did. Back in Boulder. I leaned back in my chair, the rain slowing to a drizzle, my phone still buried beneath the rag lit up once more before going dark again. The reflection of that faint glow stretched across the metal table, catching the edge of my coffee cup, the tools. And finally the small framed picture of Mom. The storm was breaking, but not over. Not yet. I took one last sip of coffee, cold and bitter, and turned back to the Chevy's open hood. The engine waited patient as always. I tightened another bolt, the metallic click echoing through the empty shop, each sound steadier than the last. Outside, the rain stopped completely. The silence it left behind was almost beautiful. The day after the storm, the air smelled clean, sharp, with the kind of quiet that comes only after everything has been shaken loose. The mountains behind Boulder were clear again, their edges no longer hidden behind rain. I had the garage doors rolled open to let in the light. I was leaning over the Chevy's engine when I heard footsteps crunching across the gravel outside. I didn't look up. The sound was too heavy, too careful to be Henry's, Madison. My father's voice called tired, too formal for the place. I kept tightening the bolt in my hand. I didn't think you'd show up here, I said. He stopped just inside the doorway. His shoes were caked with mud, a smear of it climbing up his pant leg. The suit jacket he wore didn't fit the space. Too polished for the smell of oil, too fragile for concrete floors. I shouldn't have waited this long, he said, but I didn't know where else to go. Try your office, I said, still bent over the engine. Or the new Mrs. Hale's PR department. He exhaled a slow, uneven breath. She's not handling this well. None of us are. The investors have pulled out. Eleanor won't return Vivian's calls, and the press is circling like vultures. We can't recover without you. I dropped the wrench onto the workbench. The clang echoed through the space, sharp and final. I turned to face him. Funny. You didn't need me when there were cameras around. Now suddenly, I'm the missing piece. It's not like that, he said quickly. It's exactly like that I said. You only remember I exist when your perfect image starts to crack. He took a hesitant step forward. Madison, please. I know I let you down, but this isn't about appearances anymore. This is about survival, about the company, about everything we built. I almost laughed. We didn't build anything together, Dad. You built a house of mirrors and asked me to stay invisible so no one would see the cracks. He rubbed a hand across his face. The gesture made him look older than I remembered. You're right. I failed you. I failed your mother, too. But I'm asking you now, not as your father, not as Richard Hale, but as a man who's out of answers. Help me fix this, please." The words hung in the air like dust caught in sunlight. Behind him, the sky stretched wide and blue, washed clean by the storm. I stared past his shoulder at it for a long moment, feeling the warmth slide into the room, touching the tools, the car, even the photograph of Mom above the desk. The man who once erased me from the picture now stood framed in the ruins of his own. I wiped my hands on the rag and walked to the doorway. "You know what's funny, Dad? Those cars at Vivian's expo, they didn't fail because they were old. They failed because no one cared enough to understand how they worked. They wanted them to look new, not be alive again." He nodded slowly, eyes down. "I know, I'll help," I said finally. His head snapped up. "But not for you. Not for her. I'm doing it for the cars. They deserve to live again, even if the people showing them off don't." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening before he managed to speak. "That's more than I deserve," he said quietly. "Yeah," I replied. "It is." For the first time in years, he didn't have anything left to say. He just stood there, the sound of the wind outside filling the silence between us. Then he nodded once, heavy with shame. As he turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something unfamiliar in his expression. Not pride, not even gratitude. Just regret, pure and unguarded. When he reached the truck, he stopped, one hand on the door. "I'll tell them you're coming," he said. "I'll come when I'm ready," I told him. He gave a small nod, climbed in, and drove away, leaving 2 lines of mud cutting through the clean gravel. I stood in the doorway long after the sound of the engine faded, the sunlight spilling across the floor. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like it was shining on a graveyard. The sky had cleared, the air smelled like rain turned into something new, and for a moment I let myself breathe it in. Then I went back to the workbench, picked up the wrench, and began to pack the tools I'd need for Denver. The morning air in Denver carried the smell of polish and panic. The Golden Arc Convention Center loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the sky too bright for the kind of day it was going to be. I parked behind the loading dock and sat for a minute, the hum of the engine steady beneath my hands. Then I killed it, grabbed my toolbox, and stepped out into the noise. Inside, chaos moved like a current. Technicians ran back and forth, shouting instructions over the whine of drills and the hiss of compressed air. 2 cars stood under spotlights. Both half disassembled their hoods, up smoke still curling faintly from the exhausts. The crowd of staff parted as I entered, the sound of my boots loud against the concrete floor. Every head turned. I could feel the weight of it, curiosity first, then judgment. To them, I was the outsider, the problem they didn't want but suddenly needed. A few whispered my name like it was a punchline. Vivian Brooks Hale stood at the edge of the stage, her arms crossed, voice tight. "So you came," she said. When she saw me, "I didn't think we'd meet again like this." I didn't either. I said, setting the toolbox down beside the Cadillac that had gone up in smoke during her big speech. "But the cars don't deserve to die for someone else's mistake." Her jaw twitched. "You think you can fix this in a few hours?" "I can try," I said, "which is more than what's been done so far." A few of the technicians exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whose side to take. Vivian took a step closer, lowering her voice. "You ruined this once already. Don't make it worse." I met her eyes. "I didn't ruin anything. I'm the one saving it." Eleanor Grant was standing just behind her, calm, as ever, clipboard in hand. "Let her work," she said quietly. "Or this place will be empty by tomorrow." Vivian said nothing. She moved aside, heels clicking on the floor. I opened the hood. The engine was a mess of burned wires and bad wiring decisions. Someone had rushed it, chasing presentation over precision. Typical. I started unbolting the housing, the clink of metal filling the silence. Grease stained my palms within minutes. Around me, the crowd watched as if waiting for me to fail. They called me the grease girl. I called myself the one who made the dead breathe again. I lost track of time. My body worked on muscle memory, every motion fluid, fast, certain. The rhythm built, unscrew, adjust, tighten, test. Sweat slid down my neck. The sound of wrenches striking steel turned into something almost musical. At one point, Vivian came closer, hovering just behind me. Her perfume cut through the smell of oil and metal. "Don't forget who's signing the checks here," she said softly. Without looking up, I replied, You might want to remember who's saving your reputation. She went quiet. Eleanor crouched beside me to hand over a tool. You've done this before, she said. Every day I answered. Just never with this many people watching. She smiled. That's what separates the real ones from the rest. When I hit the ignition switch for the test, the room collectively held its breath. The engine coughed once, a deep sputter that sent a ripple through the crowd. I adjusted the timing, pressed again. This time it caught. The engine roared to life, smooth and strong, the kind of sound that settled deep in your chest. A puff of white smoke rose, hung in the air for a second, and disappeared. The silence broke into applause. People clapped first out of shock, then relief. Cameras flashed again, different now, no longer hunting for failure, but something that looked suspiciously like redemption. Vivian stood, frozen, her hands clasped too tightly together. For the first time, she didn't have a line ready for the press. Across the room, Richard Hale pushed through the crowd, his expression unreadable. When his eyes met mine, something shifted. Years of distance collapsing into a single, wordless look. Pride and regret all tangled together. I wiped my hands on a rag, my heart still beating hard from the noise of it all. The technicians moved in to take over, but none of them touched the car yet. The sound of the engine filled the hall, steady and alive. Eleanor leaned toward Vivian and said quietly, "You should probably thank her." Vivian's throat moved, but the words never came out. I stepped back, wiped another streak of grease from my wrist, and said to no one in particular, "Don't shut it off yet. Let it remember how to run." For a long moment, that's all there was. The hum of a machine reborn, and the quiet realization that everyone in that room had just witnessed something they couldn't polish or fake. The woman they'd dismissed, the one they called a grease girl, had just reminded them what real restoration looked like. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt necessary. The air in the conference hall still buzzed with leftover adrenaline from the morning. The cars gleamed again beneath the white spotlights, the smell of oil replaced by perfume and champagne. Guests drifted back in, pretending they hadn't almost witnessed a catastrophe hours earlier. I stood at the edge of the room near the loading bay doors, watching from behind the curtain. Eleanor Grant stepped onto the stage with the grace of someone who didn't need a script. The press conference lights flared on cameras flashing like lightning. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady. "Today's success belongs not to a brand or a company, but to a woman whose name you probably haven't heard." She turned slightly, her eyes finding me in the shadows. Madison Hale, the engineer behind the National Restoration Project, was the one who saved this exhibition. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted, reporters shouting questions, bulbs popping like gunfire. The sound hit me like a wave. I blinked under the glare as Eleanor motioned for me to step forward. I walked out, hands still marked with grease. The light felt too bright, like standing inside a sun I hadn't asked for. Applause started somewhere near the back and rolled forward until the entire hall was clapping. Across the crowd, I saw Vivian. She stood stiff, her champagne-colored dress perfect again, but her expression cracked just enough to show what the cameras couldn't. Richard stood next to her. Eyes lowered, his mouth pressed tight. He didn't look at me. Justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it only needs enough light to make the truth visible. The microphones clustered toward me, questions blending together. How did you fix it? Were you part of the project from the beginning? What's next for Hale Restoration? I answered a few, kept it brief. The cars did what they were meant to do. I said, they just needed someone to listen. Behind the scenes, Mark Wilson from the Denver Tribune was already typing. His article went live within the hour. Grease Girl saves the show. It hit social media like a spark in dry grass. #GreaseGirlPride climbed the trending list by sunset. Back in the hotel suite upstairs, Vivian saw it all. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the headlines. My photo out in her spotlight. My name where hers used to be. The glass of wine slipped from her fingers, shattering against the tile. Eleanor found her standing there a few minutes later, the floor sticky with Merlot. "You used to be afraid of scratches," Eleanor said. "Now you'll have to learn to see the beauty in them." Vivian didn't answer. She just stared at the phone, still glowing with my face on the screen. Downstairs, I was still answering reporters when Eleanor appeared beside me. She waited until the cameras turned toward another speaker before leaning in. "Your mother would have loved this moment," she said softly. "She dreamed of seeing your work recognized like this." I smiled, the kind that hurt a little because it came from too deep inside. "I think she can hear it," I said. Eleanor nodded. Then let's make sure everyone else does too. She guided me off the stage as the applause rose again. The flashbulbs followed, but I didn't turn back. The hum of the engines behind me filled the hall steady and alive, a heartbeat that no spotlight could imitate. Outside, the winter light was fading, turning the city glass to gold. For the first time in a long while, I didn't mind the shine. I just stood there in the doorway, breathing in the air that no one could polish, feeling the kind of calm that comes only after a storm has finally named its winner. A week after the show, the world stopped applauding. The same cameras that had chased the story of the Grease girl now turned their lenses toward Vivian Brooks Hale, searching for the cracks beneath the gloss. The headlines came, one after another. Golden Ark under investigation for copyright fraud. Exclusive technology behind restoration system stolen. The first time I saw my name in a legal brief, it didn't feel like victory, just another weight I hadn't asked for, Sarah Bennett. My attorney was a woman who didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. They filed the patent under a shell company, she explained, sliding a folder across my workbench. Golden Ark signed it with Vivian's name, but the design specs match your blueprints, down to the calibration marks. I glanced at the papers, the familiar diagrams drawn in my handwriting. So she really thought she could steal something like that and no one would notice, Sarah smiled faintly. People like her don't believe in being caught. They believe in being admired. On the television, mounted in the corner of the garage, a news anchor spoke over clips from the expo. Sources confirm that the restoration system used in the Golden Ark presentation was registered under Hale Restoration Systems, a Boulder-based company owned by engineer Madison Hale. The footage cut to a shot of Vivian leaving her office, surrounded by reporters. Mrs. Brooks Hale, did you forge the contract? Did you know the technology was stolen? Cameras flashed, voices rose, and Vivian kept walking. Her face blank, but her eyes wild. I turned off the TV. The silence that followed was different this time. Not heavy, not bitter. Just quiet. By the end of the week, Golden Ark's board had issued a statement announcing her removal. Every glossy photo of her vanished from the company website. Her profile, once filled with phrases like visionary leader and icon of innovation, now redirected to an error page. Richard's company, Hale & Company, Designs took collateral damage. Investors withdrew, clients canceled projects, and within days his reputation went from respected to radioactive. He stepped down without a press release. A short article ran in the Denver Business Journal, Richard Hale resigns following Golden Ark fallout. He called once. I didn't answer. Eleanor stopped by the shop that afternoon. She looked tired, but satisfied, the kind of exhaustion that comes after finishing a long, necessary war. She placed a folder on my desk. The National Heritage Foundation wants to bring you on as a technical advisor. Full-time if you want it. The board was unanimous. I leaned back in my chair, unsure how to respond. That's a lot. It's what you earned, she said. You don't have to decide today. I nodded and she smiled before leaving her hand resting briefly on my shoulder. Your mother would have told you to take it, she said as she walked out. The next morning, the bell over the garage door jingled. I didn't expect anyone. It was too early for customers, and too late for deliveries. When I looked up, Vivian stood there. She was thinner, pale, under her makeup, eyes red like she hadn't slept in days. The woman who once terrified assistants with a glance now looked like someone who didn't know where to put her hands. Madison, she said, her voice small. I didn't know where else to go. I stayed behind the counter. That seems to be a theme lately. She took a step forward, then stopped. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I said, what I did. For pretending your work was mine. Her hands twisted together. I thought if I made it perfect, no one would notice how empty it was. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside had stopped, but water still dripped from the eaves in a slow, steady rhythm. You don't owe me an apology, I said finally. I forgave you a long time ago. She looked up surprised. You did. Yeah, but that doesn't mean we're ever going to walk the same road again. Vivian nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek before she wiped it away. She glanced around the shop, at the cars, the tools, the framed photo of my mother, and whispered, You built something real here. No, I said softly. I just rebuilt what people threw away. She managed a faint smile. Goodbye, Madison. Goodbye, Vivian. When the door closed behind her, the sound of her heels faded, until there was nothing left but the hum of the fluorescent lights. True honor never needs to be chased. It finds you when you've already stopped running. I walked to the window and looked out at the clear sky, the reflection of the garage lights catching in the chrome of a restored Mustang. The world was still loud outside. News stories, interviews, noise. But inside it was quiet again. The kind of quiet that meant everything was finally where it belonged. Spring came early that year, soft and golden, the kind that makes the air smell like fresh paint and new beginnings. The garage doors were open wide, and sunlight poured in across the floor, glinting off chrome and dust motes like confetti. Hale Restoration had changed. New banners, new faces, new laughter. Above the workbench hung a sign that read, "Women in Restoration Program." There were 5 girls in the class that morning, all in matching coveralls, all with that cautious excitement of people learning to use their hands for the first time. I showed them how to align the carburetor, where the timing marks were, how the sound of a good engine was something you didn't just hear, you felt it in your bones. Listen, I told them tightening a bolt. Engines don't lie. They'll tell you what's wrong if you let them speak. Lily Rivera, 10 years old and fearless, grinned up at me. Like people, exactly like people, I said, only easier to fix. Across the room, Henry poured coffee into mismatched mugs, humming something off-key. Tanya wiped her hands on a towel and passed one to him. The air was filled with the smell of grease coffee and spring rain sneaking through the open doors. It felt like home. Louder, busier, better. The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew my attention. A black sedan pulled up outside, clean but ordinary. The door opened and my father stepped out holding a bouquet of white lilies. He looked smaller than I remembered him, older, softer around the edges. He paused at the entrance, not wanting to interrupt. "You've got quite the operation here," he said, voice low. I handed my wrench to one of the girls and walked over. "We've been busy." He nodded, his eyes taking in every inch of the shop, the tools, the sign, the women working side by side. "Your mother would have loved this," he said. He offered me the flowers. "I just wanted to see you doing what she always said you were meant to do." I took them, the stems cool and damp in my hands. "I think she's smiling somewhere," I said. He looked at me, then really looked, and for the first time there wasn't any guilt between us, just recognition. He gave a faint smile and stepped back. "Don't let me keep you from work. You never could," I said. But this time it sounded like forgiveness. After he left, I found a small vase and set the flowers on the shelf under Mom's photo. The light caught them just right, like they belonged there. Later that afternoon, Eleanor Grant stopped by. She was dressed simply, hair pulled back, carrying a thin envelope. "Got something for you," she said, handing it over. The paper was heavy, embossed with the seal of the National Heritage Foundation. Inside was an invitation to Washington, D.C., for the annual Heritage Honors Ceremony. My name was printed neatly under Lifetime Achievement in Automotive Preservation. I stared at it for a long time before looking up. "You had something to do with this, didn't you?" Eleanor smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe the world finally caught up." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "You don't win an award for doing what you love." She touched my arm. "You do, when what you love changes everything." After she left, the garage settled into that warm hum again. The girls laughing tools, clinking. Henry cursing softly at the coffee maker. I stepped outside for a moment. The sun was starting to dip, painting the sky in the same color as the Mustang I'd restored years ago. I slid into the driver's seat of that car, the leather worn smooth, the smell of oil still clinging to the air, my hands wrapped around the wheel like they always belonged there. I turned the key. The engine came alive, smooth and steady, a heartbeat I'd helped rebuild from nothing. The sound rolled through the open air, scattering the quiet. She once told me I'd ruin the image. Turns out I became the image they needed to survive. I drove slowly down the road, the wind spilling through the window, carrying the smell of spring and gasoline. Behind me, the garage doors stood open. The laughter and light spilling out into the fading day. If you've ever been erased from a picture, remember, your worth isn't in the frame. It's in the light that refuses to fade when the flash is gone. If you believe in the power of silence, the kind that builds, not breaks, share this story. Some people need to hear that redemption doesn't always make noise. Sometimes it just runs smooth.